Chapter 4 of Barfield's Speaker's Meaning. Subject and Object in the History of Meaning. The aim of this concluding chapter is to point to certain far-reaching consequences which flow from the content of the previous chapters. There will be no attempt in the space available to do much more than point, and it must be understood that a case is being stated rather than argued. Since it is consequences I am dealing with, the pointing will itself of course consist of argument. That is intended to establish not the case itself, which would require much more fuller treatment, but the fact that there is a prima facie case, however disturbing, certainly for further reflection and possibly for further investigation on the reader's part. It has been shown then in the last 3 chapters that if we look into the past, as well as looking back onto it, we find 3 things. Looking back in that way at the history of humanity, and even further back into the history of the earth before the physical organism of Homo sapiens appeared on it, and particularly if we endeavor to do so with the help of reflection on the nature of language in its historical aspect, we have the following experiences. In the domain of art and poetry, we find ourselves looking back through a psychology of imagination into one of inspiration. In the domain of language, we find ourselves looking back through what we are accustomed to call literal meaning into figurative or translucent meaning. And lastly, we find ourselves looking back through history into prehistory. We find, moreover, that the period we characterize as prehistory has its own distinctive quality and is not merely history extrapolated. And we find that these 3 separate perspectives into the past have this in common, that they all involve retrospect through a comparatively recent past, which has been characterized by self-conscious activity of the subject over against the object, into a very much longer preceding one, which was characterized by relative passivity of the subject over and against its object. I am speaking here of quote-unquote passivity in the sense that the recipient of anything we can justifiably call inspiration is passive because he could not be otherwise. If he were otherwise, it would not be inspiration. From this, it is necessary to distinguish another kind of mental passivity that concerned us in Chapter 2, the inertia of habit, on the part of a subject already existentially freed from its object, or in the case of poetry, quote-unquote freed from inspiration. This is the kind that Coleridge called, quote, the lethargy of custom, end quote. It is rather bare inactivity than passivity strictly understood. But since both are opposites of activity, there is a risk of the one being confused with the other, a confusion it is vital to avoid. It has also been emphasized that these perspectives are out of harmony with, or rather directly opposed to, those generally assumed by our contemporaries to be the correct ones. By contrast, our contemporaries assume, for the most part, that at least in the beginning, something like imagination must be taken to have preceded inspiration, that in the development of language, literal meanings preceded figurative or translucent meaning, and lastly, that an equivalent of history, that is, events involving individual mental activity, came before prehistory. In short, it is assumed that what we may now perhaps call quote-unquote active subjectivity preceded the passive subjectivity that was characteristic alike of inspiration, of language in its early stages, and of the prehistoric phase of consciousness. Here, I think, is the appropriate place to point out that this tendency to conceive of prehistory in terms of history extrapolated is strikingly exemplified in the historical or evolutionary scheme presented to us by the late Teilhard de Chardin in his Phenomenon of Man and other books. This is not said to depreciate Chardin. Rather, it is because, after all the adverse criticism, I remain impressed by the scope and ingenuity of his thought, that I select him as a particularly striking example. Chardin divides his history of the universe into 3 periods, which he designates respectively: matter, life, and thought. There is scarcely any reference at all to language in the phenomenon of man. Certainly there is no reference at all at the all-important point where it belongs, which is the point of transition from his second to his third period. That's from life to thought. From passive life, subjectively passive life, to active thought. Yet in excluding this, he renounces all possibility of any understanding of the prehistoric phase in the evolution of consciousness. To return to the perspectives, anyone who puts forward three propositions, and who then goes on to remark that in each case they are almost exactly contrary to the received opinion in his own day, is under a double obligation. In such a case, it is not enough for him to argue as faultlessly as he can in support of his own heterodox contentions. He must also, if he is a reasonable man, try to account for the orthodox and, in his view, erroneous opinions of the great majority. To take an example, as long as the geocentric view of the solar system continued to be accepted almost everywhere as a matter of course, anyone who preferred the heliocentric perspective was bound not merely to show that it quite obviously gives a much more satisfactory account of the facts as known, but also to offer some explanation why, in spite of this, the geocentric perspective should have so long and so universally prevailed. The first obligation having been discharged to the best of my ability in the preceding chapters, I'm now faced with the second. Here I feel myself on dangerous ground, for the reason that most of what I shall be saying is, there is no other word for it, taboo. It probably sounds sensational to put it that way, but long experience has taught me that it is not. Most people assume that there are no taboos left nowadays in sophisticated society, but they are quite wrong. The old taboos have gone, it is true. Thus, I should feel no embarrassment if the argument obliged me at this point to defend the position of atheism, or even of aristocracy in politics, or to advance some new theory of love based on sexual perversion and involving a detailed discussion of the sexual organs in their normal and abnormal manifestation. But the old taboos have merely been replaced by new ones. Those I have just alluded to are dead or dying ones, whereas the one I shall be infringing is very much alive, and a wise man thinks twice before laying sacrilegious hands on the Lord's anointed. The question is then, how has it come about that people make the false assumptions they do make before they begin to think at all about imagination, or about the origin and development of language, or about the relation between history and prehistory? It has come about because the whole way in which these subjects are approached, the kinds of questions people are willing to ask themselves, or of thoughts they are willing to entertain as even worth examining, are all determined by theories taken over from other disciplines altogether than those of philology or aesthetics or history. The theories, for instance, of biology have been taken over in this way, both directly in the shape of the biological emphasis under which the whole story of evolution is commonly viewed, and indirectly through an anthropology which has itself been based from the start on 19th century biological theories of evolution. Unfortunately, the whole scope of the ideas regarded as eligible to be entertained concerning the evolution of language and art and concerning history and prehistory has been predetermined by results arrived at in disciplines other than their own. At this point, the comment may well be made, well, what is wrong with that? What could be better? What could be better or more likely to lead us toward the goal of truth than that the various disciplines of the human mind, the different sciences, should interact and mutually modify and correct one another? The answer is that nothing could be better, provided only that all this be done with care and without undue haste, provided in particular that neither in our own discipline nor in anyone else's do we make the all too common mistake of forgetting to distinguish between actual observation or actual experience on the one hand, and hypotheses or theories erected on that observation or that experience on the other hand. Otherwise, we may find ourselves abandoning a truth which we ought to have retained and accepting an illusion we ought to have detected. Thus, if someone comes to me as a historical student of language and says, quote, "The conclusions you have arrived at concerning the origin and early stages of human speech, which seem to you so inescapable, are incompatible with what I have firmly established in another field of investigation altogether," end quote. Or perhaps he puts it more tersely and says, quote, "What you have been saying is very pretty, but of course it is quite unscientific," end quote. Then I shall listen to him very carefully indeed, naturally, because it may be that I shall have to abandon my inescapable conclusions, go back to the beginning, and set about finding out where I went wrong. But before I go to those lengths, I shall want to examine very carefully exactly what it is that my informant has established. And when I have done that, I shall want to use my own judgment, not his, in deciding whether it is in fact incompatible with my own conclusions. This is likely to involve distinguishing rather ruthlessly between the observed facts and the theories erected on them. In the case of evolution, the observed facts are a variety of surviving vegetable, animal, and human remains, together with the observed results of any chemical or physical analysis to which we can subject them. That and no more. All beyond that is unverifiable, however attractive, hypothesis. Next, having first been careful to make this all-important distinction, I shall want to examine the theories themselves as theories. Can they, for instance, be tested? And have they been tested by experiment? Here, of course, as in the case of any discipline that seeks to reconstruct the past hypothetically, the answer must be no. You cannot predict the behavior of the past and then verify your prediction by experiment. There will be other questions too I shall want to ask. Having assembled all this protective armament around me, I shall then go on to the next step, which is the exercise of my own judgment. For instance, if we pass from the observed facts of the biological and geological panorama to the theories erected on them, we reach first of all the central pillar of evolutionary theory, namely, the idea that in a remote past, the vegetable, animal, and human kingdoms, whose remains we found preserved in such rich variety, appeared physically on earth in that order, first a vegetable, then an animal, then a human kingdom. I find no difficulty in accepting this hypothesis, verified or unverified, because there's nothing in such an idea incompatible with the observations made in my own field. But of course, I do not forget, in accepting it, that what is being spoken of so far is simply the physical forms, the quote-unquote outside of nature. It is the nature we look back on to. It is when the next step is taken by the biologists, and it is usually taken in the form of a tacit assumption rather than an explicit deduction, that I find myself compelled not only to use my own judgment, but actually to prefer my own to theirs. I mean the adoption, together with this chronologically arranged evolution of outsides, of another all-important assumption concerning the evolution of insides, and in particular concerning the insides or consciousness of Homo sapiens. It is this assumption that colors the popular concept, or no concept, of instinct. The preceding chapters have endeavored to show contraction of meaning as a process that has evidently been characteristic of language from its earliest known stages. Something was also said in them of the counter-process of an expansion of meaning. Yet, if the presuppositions of the evolutionists are to be accepted, the evolution of consciousness has always been a process of expansion only. The world began, according to them, with non-consciousness, a kind of existential objectivity, without a subject. Then consciousness appeared at a point in space, located in some physical organism, and then this consciousness progressively expanded until in the organism of Homo sapiens, it took the form of human consciousness. Thereafter, it continued to expand further and further throughout the phases of prehistory and ultimately of history and of modern civilization. It can be seen that the presuppositions on which this whole picture is based are twofold. a psychological or a physiological one, and a historical or chronological one. Though it is true that the latter can be resolved into the former, so that in a sense they are one single presupposition, although, I'll just reread that. It can be seen that the presuppositions on which this whole picture is based are twofold: a psychological or physiological one, and a historical or chronological one. Though it is true that the latter can be resolved into the former, so that in a sense they are now one single presupposition. I call them presuppositions now rather than theories or speculations, partly because they are rarely, if ever, systematically argued, and partly because they have been taken for granted by so many for so long that they have gone down into the unconscious and become implicit in the meanings of all sorts of words we habitually employ to think with. To pause here and give one or two examples, there is the adjective collective, in Jung's concept of a collective unconscious. The term collective already implies an aggregation of pre-existing self-contained units, and therefore presupposes that an expansion from individual to group experiences preceded any contraction from group to individual. Again, there is the word animism when used by anthropologists or in any discourse on the nature and origin of myths. This, quote-unquote, fixes a certain presumed original relation between man and nature in much the same way that collective fixes a presumed original relation between individual and group consciousness. And here I find it worth remarking that the poet C.D. Lewis, in his book The Poetic Image, uses this word very differently and less misleadingly when he affirms, and speaking of the images used in modern poetry and thus of an expansion of consciousness, that, quote, every image is animistic, end quote. In philosophy, I trace the presuppositions in the meanings of such words as empirical and transcendental. But of course, it is not only a matter of such semi-technical terms as I've just now instanced. There are everyday words like reality. Although the matter of this chapter was described at its outset as quote-unquote far-reaching, it is also incisively significant in many intimate and ostensibly circumscribed contexts. Literary criticism is one of these, as anyone may verify for himself who will take the trouble to abstract the presuppositions given in, for example, Professor F.R. Levy's repeated applications of quote-unquote real, quote-unquote reality, realize, concrete, in arriving at his value judgments. The first of the two presuppositions is that quote-unquote inwardness, subjectivity of any sort, is not merely associated with, but is always the product of a stimulated organism. The second, arising out of it, is the presupposition that in the history of the universe, the presence of what is called matter preceded the presence of what is called mind. To these two, one could perhaps add a third, namely that the public world, which is what we have in common with others, consists entirely of what we perceive, and the private world of each one consists of what he thinks. For the reasons given at the beginning of the chapter, I must dispose of this third one in a parentheses. It is not difficult to show that on a strictly distributive analysis of the complex blend of thought and perceptions which constitutes what we normally experience as outside of and other than ourselves, the exact opposite is the case. It is the thought content which we share with others, while our percepts, so far as they are undetermined by any element of thought, are private to ourselves. It would be fairly easy to show this, but not without a considerable digression. It is perhaps now becoming apparent why I began by calling these two presuppositions taboos. When presupposition suppositions get into the lexical meaning of words and thus into the unconscious itself, they are apt to become taboos in the sense that when people start thinking about some topic or other, the near prospect that their train of reasoning may be leading to a conclusion which will infringe the taboo causes them to stop reasoning and make a jump of some sort. This is particularly apparent in our own day, when near prospects of just that kind of conclusion are beginning to show up in a good many fields of inquiry. As examples of these, I shall adduce the increasing prominence of so-called holistic theories in biology, psychology, and philosophy, the concept of gestalt in psychology, and in general an increasing realization of the causal significance of quote-unquote pattern as distinct from particle or impact. In physics, moreover, there is the discovery of the implication, already at the nuclear level, of the observer in what he observes. Nor would I admit the endeavor already noticed in Chapter 1 to set up history as no longer merely a branch of natural science, but as a separate mode of knowledge altogether. Now, all these lines of thought, if they are followed through to the end, may lead to conclusions infringing the taboo. They are therefore not followed through to their logical conclusions, but at a certain point in the reasoning, fantastic leaps are made. That old hypothesis of a metaphorical period, for instance, so as to enable them to be hustled into accord with the prevailing climate of opinion, with the taboos, in fact. We have already reminded ourselves where the general body of modern knowledge stands concerning the actual relation of natural object to thinking, perceiving subject. One great advantage of reading the history of language as it stands before us, unboulderized by the taboos, is the making unnecessary these reluctant intellectual contortions on the brink of the chasm between what everybody really knows and what everybody feels positive about. I shall refer once again to R.G. Collingwood's idea of history because one part of it affords a particularly striking example of what I mean. In my first chapter, I cited his principle that, quote, all real history is history of thought, end quote. And the reader was reminded how, in support of this, he points out that when the same thought occurs in two different minds, you have not two separate thoughts, the one being a detached replica of the other, but one in the same thought. You have, as emphasized by Collingwood himself, not merely identity, but numerical identity. At this point, I remarked that this was the kind of statement that made people feel uneasy, and I did so because this observation on the nature of thought is in flat contradiction of the presupposition that thought is the product of a stimulated physical organism. If taken seriously, it transgresses the first taboo. If a concept in my mind is one and the same with the concept in yours, then it clearly cannot be the product of either my organism or yours. It cannot be dependent on those organisms any more than the light we both see by is dependent on your eye or mine. It is not light that is dependent on an eye, but the experience of seeing. However, the point I want to make is that because it is taboo, Collingwood makes it clear as he proceeds that although he says this about thought, he does not really believe it. Although he has propounded it himself and propounded it cogently and precisely, he finds he cannot believe it. It would be too great a deviation, and so, like all the others, he sidesteps rather than pursue his own train of reasoning whither it must inevitably lead him. For if he had really believed what he said, he of all men could never have gone on to draw the kind of distinction he does draw between man and nature, that distinction on which he has based his whole doctrine of the unbridgeable gulf between history and science. He bases that doctrine on the presupposition that, which he takes for granted, that man has what he calls an inside, but nature has no inside. Thought, of which he says history consists, is the inside of man and his actions, but nature has no corresponding inside, no inside at all. We see that in denying an inside to nature, he is really still conceiving thought as the product of a man's physical organism, although this is quite incompatible with that view of the super individual essence of thought which he himself has just categorically stated. Possibly, I have now succeeded in making clear why I select such a sensational term as taboo. I am not, of course, saying that there is an embargo on a man's arriving at and even expounding some kind of idealist philosophy or other, some abstract theory or rational demonstration that mind must be conceived as anterior to matter, or coming before matter. Berkeleyism, Kantianism, Neo-Kantianism, Bergencism, Buddhism, there is a wide choice. No. What the taboo enjoins is that he shall put all that out of his mind as soon as he lays down his pen or leaves the lecture room. Above all, that he shall not attempt to apply it in any other realm of inquiry that he may enter, an inquiry, for instance, into the origin of language or of myth, or, if he happens to be a scientist, into the basis of post-Cartesian scientific method. As soon as he goes on to do this, he is bound as a respectable member of educated society to start off from a whole array of presuppositions that are quite incompatible with the conclusions he has arrived at as a philosopher or physicist or whatever. It was indicated in the course of the first 3 chapters that, at least in my own field of study, everything points to an evolution of consciousness, which, up to as recently as 3 or 4 centuries ago, has mainly taken the form of a contraction of meaning, and therefore of consciousness. An evolution from wide and vague to narrow and precise, and from what was peripherally based to what is centrally based. Further, that if this predominance of contraction is demonstrably true of the historical period up to now, it was even truer of the prehistoric period. If history has been par excellence the period of developing thought, prehistory was par excellence the period of developing language, the period of the original emergence of speaker's meaning from lexical meaning, that the period, therefore, during which man was slowly and painfully extracting his subjectivity from language. That is, as Cassirer, for one, has so convincingly demonstrated, from the inside of nature, through the medium of language. It must be admitted that this is a topic on which it is difficult to be concise without being inaccurate. Quote, man was extracting, end quote, it was said. But since the very thing he was extracting was his subjectivity, he ought not to have been made the subject of a sentence at all. Quote, the period during which man's subjectivity was being extracted, end quote, would have been more accurate, if less elegant. Finally, I have tried in this chapter to suggest that our backward glance cannot really stop at prehistory. We are inevitably taken back, behind the prehistorical, to what is perhaps best called the primeval period, or in other words, to nature herself. It was at this point that Collingwood executed his sidestep, and he no doubt did so because the nature to which we are thus led back must be so very different from the primeval nature assumed by the evolutionists. We cannot help that. We are no longer in the shoes of Collingwood and his contemporaries. Once we have smashed the first taboo, once we have transferred the shadowy and forbidding figure with outstretched arms from the twilight of its native grove, in which we have hitherto been beholding it, to the dry light of the museum where it belongs, and have seen that, after all, it is only a carved wooden totem pole, we are through not only with the first taboo, but with the second also. As a result, we find ourselves with a nature very different from the nature assumed by the evolutionists. The odd thing is that once one has got over the shock, this nature turns out to be more, not less, like the nature. More, not less, like the nature we actually see, hear, smell, and generally experience around us. Easier, not harder to believe in than theirs. The plain fact is that if we really look at nature, if we really observe her without that taboo at the back of our minds, there is nothing whatever to suggest that she has no inside. Indeed, there is everything to suggest the contrary. The concept of instinct, however it is taken, alone applies as much. For instinct cannot be understood, cannot honestly be conceived, otherwise than as a super-individual wisdom at work in nature. This is again a matter which could not be pursued without our being carried too far afield. However, if anyone is minded to examine the relation between instinct and wisdom, and again between both of these, and what we call the unconscious in man, I would recommend him to consult some of E. L. Grant Watson's books, and in particularly perhaps the one that appeared in 1964 under the title The Mystery of Physical Life. We are free at last, then, if there is anything at all in what has been said, to accept that the whole character and history of language cries aloud to us, namely that the prevailing assumption that matter preceded mind in the history of the universe is a historical fallacy, and alas, one with far-reaching consequences. It becomes clear to us that both ontogenetically and phylogenetically, subjectivity is never something that was developed out of nothing at some point in space, but is a form of consciousness that has contracted from the periphery into individual centers. Phylogenetically, it becomes clear to us that the task of Homo sapiens, when he first appeared as a physical form on Earth, was not to evolve a faculty of thought somehow out of nothing, but to transform the unfree wisdom which he experienced through his organism as given meaning into the free subjectivity that is correlative only to active thought, to the individual activity of thinking. As the history of philosophy reflects the latest stage of this age-long process, so the semantic history of the words, subject and subjective, reflects the history of philosophy. Thus, for subjective, we find in the Oxford English Dictionary, supported by quotations, the lexical meaning in the 17th century, pertaining to the essence or reality of a thing, real, essential. A further lexical meaning, but dating back now only to the first half of the 18th century, is having its source in the mind. By the second half of the same century, we have pertaining or peculiar to an individual subject or his mental operations, personal, individual. So far, we have the connotation of reality, plus a steadily increasing emphasis on the activity of the individual. It is reserved for the second half of the 19th century to go to the length of actually reversing the meaning in one respect, so that the adjective, whose lexical meaning was real, essential, becomes an adjective whose lexical meaning is existing in the mind only, without anything real to correspond it with it. Illusory, fanciful. It is clear, I think, that this equation of individualized mind with unreality, which is implicit in its predominant lexical meaning today, erupted into subjective from the the factitious picture prevalent in the 19th century of a world of existential objects chronologically anterior to any existential subject, and therefore supposed to be more quote-unquote real. A world of outsides with no inside to them. We have forgotten that the concept of an object without a subject is as abstract as the concept of a surface without a depth, and as futile as that of a back without a front. As against this, I have contended that an overall historical semantic point, as against this, I have contended that an overall historical semantic points to successive phases marking a progression from one type of subject-object relation towards another, from the state of active object correlative to passive subject, to the state of a passive object correlative to active subject. Moreover, since the two are, and must always have been, correlative, a change in the relation between them is, at the same time, a radical alteration in both of the principles themselves. It is this unfixedness of both object and subject, as I have already indicated in the first chapter, that constitutes the fatal weakness of behaviorism as a philosophical or scientific system, whatever value it may have, either for psychology or for linguistics, as an ad hoc technique adopted for certain limited purposes. But it is also the fatal weakness of anti-historicism, for anti-historicism is based on an unargued presupposition that the relation between subjective man and an objective world which he experiences and with which he has to deal has always remained fundamentally the same. In one period, he has dealt with it in one way, in another period in another, rather as a sick man turns first onto this side and then onto that, hoping to find the most comfortable accommodation for his aching limbs. The late H.A.L. Fisher puts the case for anti-historicism incisively as well as ironically in the preface to his History of Europe. Quote, "Men wiser and more learned than I have discerned in history a plot, a rhythm, a predetermined pattern. These harmonies are concealed from me. I can see only one emergency following upon another, as wave follows upon wave. Only one great fact with respect to which, since it is unique, there can be no generalizations. Only one safe rule for the historian, that he should recognize in the development of human destinies the play of the contingent and the unforeseen." End quote. The picture has some truth in it, but it is not the whole story. Harmonies will always remain concealed from those who decline to look in the only direction where they could possibly be found. As the harmonies from a piano are not to be found by confining our attention to the unforeseen and eccentric behavior pattern of its keys. If nature has no inside, then neither has history, for the quote-unquote thought which Collingwood cast for that role can be no more than a flicker in the skulls of a string of creatures whose lives are nasty, brutish, and short. But the historical study of language does point us to an inside of both man and nature, and in so doing reveals a clear enough plot, extending from nature through prehistory into history. As to the rhythms, I do not see why an intelligent person should even start looking for any until he has first conceded that there is a plot, that it is a play we are watching, and not just a romp or a harlequinade. And my suggestion has been that, just as it is with an ordinary play, we can only make that discovery by not merely watching happenings, but also understanding words.